Impossible? Absolutely out of the question. The whole notion's unthinkable. Why? Silk chewed at his lower lip for a moment. Let's go back to the wagons, he said shortly. They turned and went down through the dark trees with the bright morning sunlight slanting on their backs in the frosty air. They rode the back lanes for the rest of the day. Late in the afternoon, when the sun had begun to drop into a purple bank of clouds toward the west, they arrived at the farm where they were to pick up Mingan's hams. Silk spoke with the stout farmer and showed him the piece of parchment Mingan had given them in Darin.
"I'll be glad to get rid of 'em," the farmer said. "You've been occupying storage space that I sorely need."
That's frequently the case when one has dealings with Tonedrons, Silk observed. They are gifted at getting a bit more than they pay for, even if it's only the free use of someone else's storage sheds. The farmer glumly agreed. I wonder, Silk said, as if the thought had just occurred to him. I wonder if you might have seen a friend of mine, Brill by name? A medium-sized man with black hair and beard and a cast to one eye?
"Patched clothes and a sour disposition?" the stout farmer asked.
Yes, that's him.
He's been about the area. Looking, or so he said, for an old man and a woman and a boy. Said that they stole some things from his master, and that he'd been sent to find them.
How long ago was that?
A week or so.
Oh, I'm sorry to have missed him. I wish I had the leisure to look him up.
I can't think for my life why, the farmer said bluntly. To be honest with you, I don't much care for your friend.
Oh, I'm not over fond of him myself, but the truth is that he owes me some money. I could quite easily do without Brittle's companionship, but I am lonesome for the money, if you take my meaning. The farmer laughed. I'd take it as a kindness if you happen to forget that I asked after him. He'll likely be hard enough to find, even if he isn't warned that I am looking for him.
You can depend on my discretion, the stout man said, still laughing. I'm gotten a loft where you and your wagoners can put up for night. I'd take it kindly if you'd sup with my workers in the dining hall over there.
Well, my thanks to you, Silk said, bowing slightly. The ground's cold. It's been some time since we've eaten anything but the rough fare of the road.
You wagoners lead adventuresome lives, the stout man said almost enviously. Free as birds, always a new horizon just beyond next hilltop.
It is much overrated, Silk told him. And winter's a thin time for birds and wagoners both. The farmer laughed again, clapping Silk on the shoulder and then showing him where to put up the horses. The food in the stout farmer's dining hall was plain, but there was plenty, and the loft was a bit draughty, but the hay was soft. Gurion slept soundly. The farm was not Faldor's, but it was familiar enough, and there was that comforting sense of having walls about him again that made him feel secure. The following morning, after a solid breakfast, they loaded the wagons with the Tonedron's salt-crusted hams and bade the farmer a friendly goodbye. The clouds that had begun to bank up in the west the evening before had covered the sky during the night, and it was cold and gray as they set out for Muros, 50 leagues to the south. Chapter 9. The almost 2 weeks it took them to reach Muros were the most uncomfortable Gurion had ever spent. Their route skirted the edge of the foothills through rolling and sparsely settled country, and the sky hung gray and cold overhead. There were occasional spits of snow, and the mountains loomed black against the skyline to the east. It seemed to Gurion that he would never be warm again. Despite Dernick's best efforts to find dry firewood each night, their fires always seemed pitifully small, and the great cold around them enormously large. The ground upon which they slept was always frozen, and the chill seemed actually to seep into Gurion's bones. His education in the Dresnian secret language continued, and he became, if not adept, at least competent by the time they passed Lake Kamar, and began the long downhill grade that led to Muros. The city of Muros, in south-central Sindaria, was a sprawling, unattractive place that had been, since time immemorial, the site of a great annual fair. Each year in late summer, Algar horsemen drove vast cattle herds through the mountains along the great north road to Muros, where cattle buyers from all over the west gathered to await their coming. Huge sums changed hands, and because the Algar clansmen also commonly made their yearly purchases of useful and ornamental articles at that time, merchants from as far away as Naissa in the remote south gathered to offer their wares. A large plain which lay to the east of the city was given over entirely to the cattle pens that stretched for miles, but were still inadequate to contain the herds which arrived at the height of the season. Beyond the pens, to the east, lay the more or less permanent encampment of the Algars. It was to this city, one mid-morning, at the tag end of the fair, when the cattle pens were nearly empty and most of the Algars had departed, and only the most desperate merchants remained, that Silk led the 3 wagons laden with the hams of Mengen the Tolnedrin. The delivery of the hams took place without incident, and the wagons soon drew into an inn-yard near the northern outskirts of the city. "This is a respectable inn, great lady," Silk assured Aunt Paul as he helped her down from the wagon. "I have stopped here before." "Oh, let us hope so," she said. "The inns of Muros have an unsavory reputation." "Those particular inns lie along the eastern edge of the town," Silk assured her delicately. "I know them well." "I'm certain you do," she said, with an arched eyebrow. "My profession sometimes requires me to seek out places I might otherwise prefer to avoid." The inn, Geryon noted, was surprisingly clean, and its guests seemed for the most part to be Sandarian merchants. "I thought there'd be many different kinds of people here in Muros," he said, as he and Silk carried their bundles up to the chambers on the second floor. "There are," Silk said, "but each group tends to remain aloof from the others. The Tolnedrins gather in one part of the town, the Drasnians in another, the Naissans in yet another. The Earl of Muros prefers it that way. Tempers sometimes flare in the heat of the day's business, and it's best not to have natural enemies housed under the same roof." Geryon nodded. "You know," he said, as they entered the chambers they had taken for their stay in Muros, "I don't think I've ever seen a Naissan." You're lucky," Silk said with distaste. "They are an unpleasant race." "Are they like the Murgos?" "No," Silk said. "The Naissans worship Issa, the snake god, and it's considered seemly among them to adopt the mannerisms of the serpent. I don't find it at all attractive myself. Besides, the Naissans murdered the Raven King, and all Alons have disliked them since then." "The Ravens don't have a king," Geryon objected. Not anymore," Silk said. "They did once, though, until Queen Selmisra decided to have him murdered." "When was that?" Geryon asked, fascinated. 1,300 years ago," Silk said, as if it had only been yesterday. "Isn't that sort of a long time to hold a grudge?" "Some things are unforgivable," Silk said shortly. Since there was still a good part of the day left, Silk and Wolf left the inn that afternoon to search the streets of Muros for those strange, lingering traces that Wolf could apparently see or feel, and which would tell him whether the object they sought had passed this way. Geryon sat near the fire in the chamber he shared with Aunt Paul, trying to bake the chill out of his feet. Aunt Paul also sat by the fire, mending one of his tunics, her shining needle flickering in and out of the fabric. "Who was the Raven King, Aunt Paul?" She stopped sewing. "Why do you ask?" "Silk was telling me about Naissans. He told me that their queen murdered the Raven King. Why would she do that?" You are full of questions today, aren't you? She asked him, her needle moving again. Well, Silk and I talk about a lot of things as we ride along, Geryon said, pushing his feet even closer to the fire. Don't burn your shoes. Silk says that I'm not a Centaur. He says that he doesn't know what I am, but that I'm not a Centaur. Silk talks too much, Aunt Paul observed. Well, you never tell me anything, Aunt Paul, he said in irritation. I tell you everything that you need to know, she said calmly. Right now it is not necessary for you to know anything about Raven Kings or Niacin Queens. All you want to do is to keep me an ignorant child, Geryon said petulantly. I'm almost a man, and I don't even know what I am, or who. I know who you are, she said, not looking up. Well, who am I then? You are a young man who's about to catch his shoes on fire. He jerked his feet back quickly. You didn't answer me. That's right, she said in that infuriatingly calm voice. Well, why not? It's not necessary for you to know yet. When it is time, I will tell you, but not until. But that's not fair. The world's full of injustice. Now, since you are feeling so manly, why don't you fetch some more firewood? That will give you something useful to think about. He glared at her and stamped across the room. Geryon, she said. What? Don't even think about slamming the door. That evening, when Wolf and Silk returned, the usually cheerful old man seemed impatient and irritable. He sat down at the table in the common room of the inn and stared moodily at the fire. I don't think it passed this way, he said finally. There are a few places left to try, but I'm almost certain that it hasn't been here. Then we go on to Kamar, Barak rumbled, his thick fingers combing his bristling beard. We must, Wolf said. Most likely we should have gone there first. There is no way to know it, Aunt Paul told him. Why would he go to Kamar if he's trying to carry it to the Angarak kingdoms? I can't even be certain where he's going. Maybe he wants to keep the thing for himself. He has always coveted it. Wolf stared into the fire again. We're going to need some kind of freight for the trip to Kamar, Silk said. Wolf shook his head. It slows us too much. It's not unusual for wagons to return to Kamar from Muros without freight, and it's reaching the point where we'll have to gamble our disguise for the sake of speed. It's 40 leagues to Kamar, and the weather is turning bad. A heavy snowstorm could stop the wagons entirely, and I don't have time to spend the whole winter mired down in a snowbank. Dernick dropped his knife suddenly and started to scramble to his feet. What's amiss? Barak asked quickly. I just saw Brill, Dernick said. It was in that doorway. Are you sure? I know him, Dernick said grimly. It was Brill, all right. Silk pounded his fist down on the table. Idiot, he accused himself. I underestimated the man. That doesn't matter now, Mr. Wolf said, and there was almost a kind of relief in his voice. Our disguise is useless now. I think it's time for speed. I'll go see to the wagons, Dernick said. No, the wagons are too slow. We'll go to the camp of the Algars and buy good horses. He stood up quickly. What are the wagons? Dernick persisted. Forget them. They're only a hindrance now. We'll ride the wagon horses to the camp of the Algars and take only what we can conveniently carry. Let's get ready to leave immediately. Meet me in the inn yard as soon as you can. He went quickly to the door and out into the cold night. It was only a few minutes later that they all met near the door to the stable in the cobblestoned inn yard, each carrying a small bundle. Hulking Barak jingled as he walked, and Geryon could smell the oiled steel of his mail shirt. A few flakes of snow drifted down through the frosty air, settling like tiny feathers on the frozen ground. Dernick was the last to join them. He came breathlessly out of the inn and pressed a small handful of coins upon Mr. Wolfe.
"It's the best I could do," he apologized. "Scarce half the worth of the wagons. But the innkeeper sensed my haste and bargained meanly."
He shrugged then.
"At least we're rid of them. It's not good to leave things of value behind. They nag at the mind and distract one from the business at hand."
Silk laughed. "Dernick, you are the absolute soul of a cinder."
"One must follow one's nature," Dernick said.
"Thank you, my friend,"
Wolfe said gravely, dropping the coins into his purse.
"Let's lead the horses. Galloping through these narrow streets at night would only attract attention." "I'll lead,"
Beric announced, drawing his sword.
"If there's any trouble, I am best equipped to deal with it."
"I'll walk alongside you, friend Beric,"
Dernick said, hefting a stout cudgel of firewood. Beric nodded, his eyes grimly bright, and led his horse out through the gate with Dernick closely at his side. Taking his lead from Dernick, Garion paused momentarily as he passed the woodpile and selected a good oak stick. It had a comforting weight, and he swung it a few times to get the feel of it. Then he saw Aunt Paul watching him, and he hurried on without any further display. The streets through which they passed were narrow and dark, and the snow had begun to fall a bit more heavily now, settling almost lazily through the dead, calm air. The horses, made skittish by the snow, seemed to be fearful and crowded close to those who led them. When the attack came, it was unexpected and swift. There was a sudden rush of footsteps and the sharp ring of steel on steel as Beric fended off the first blow with his sword. Garion could see only the shadowy figures outlined against the falling snow, and then, as once before when in his boyhood he had struck down his friend Runderig in mock battle, his ears began to ring. His blood surged boilingly in his veins as he leaped into the fight, ignoring the single cry from Aunt Paul. He received a smart rap on the shoulder, whirled, and struck with his stick. He was rewarded with a muffled grunt. He struck again, and then again, swinging his club at those parts of his shadowy enemy which he instinctively knew were most sensitive. The main fight, however, surged around Beric and Dernick. The ring of Beric's sword and the thump of Dernick's cudgel resounded in the narrow street, along with the groans of their assailants.
"There's the boy!"
a voice rang out from behind them, and Garion whirled. 2 men were running down the street toward him, one with a sword, the other with a wicked-looking curved knife. Knowing it was hopeless, Garion raised his club, but Silk was there. The small man launched himself from the shadows directly at the feet of the 2, and all 3 crashed to the street in a tangle of arms and legs. Silk rolled to his feet like a cat, spun, and kicked one of the floundering men solidly just below the ear. The man sank, twitching to the cobblestones. The other scrambled away and half rose just in time to receive both of Silk's heels in his face as the rat-faced Drasnian leaped into the air, twisted and struck with both legs. Then Silk turned almost casually. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. You're awfully good at this kind of thing." "I'm an acrobat. It's simple once you know how." "They're getting away." Silk turned, but the 2 he had just put down were dragging themselves into the dark alley. There was a triumphant shout from Beric, and Garion saw that the rest of the attackers were fleeing. At the end of the street, in the snow-speckled light from a small window, was Brill, almost dancing with fury.
"Cowards!"
he shouted at his hirelings.
"Cowards!"
And then Beric started for him, and he too turned and ran. "Are you all right, Aunt Paul?" Garion said, crossing the street to where she stood. "Of course I am. And don't do that again, young man," she snapped. "Leave street brawling to those better suited for it." "I was all right. I had my stick here." "Don't argue with me. I did not go to all the trouble of raising you to have you end up dead in a gutter." Is everyone all right? Dernick asked anxiously, coming back to them. Of course we are. Why don't you see if you can help the old wolf with the horses? She snapped peevishly.
Certainly, Mistress Paul,
Dernick said mildly.
A splendid little fight,
Beric said, wiping his sword as he joined them.
Not much blood, but satisfying all the same.
I'm delighted you found it so, Aunt Paul said acidly. I don't much care for such encounters. Did they leave anyone behind?
Regrettably, no, dear lady. The quarters were too narrow for good strokes, and these stones are too slippery for good footing. I marked a couple of them quite well, however. We managed to break a few bones and dent a head or two. As a group, they were much better at running than at fighting.
Silk came back from the alley where he had pursued the two who had tried to attack Geryon. His eyes were bright and his grin was vicious. Invigorating, he said, and then laughed for no apparent reason. Wolf and Dernick had managed to calm their wild-eyed horses and lead them back to where Geryon and the others stood.
Is anyone hurt?
Wolf demanded.
We are all intact,
Beric rumbled.
The business was hardly worth drawing a sword for.
Geryon's mind was racing. In his excitement, he spoke without stopping to consider the fact that it might be wiser to think the whole thing through first. How did Brill know we were in Muros? He asked. Silk looked at him sharply, his eyes narrowing. Perhaps he followed us from Winold. But we stopped and looked back. He wasn't following when we left, said Geryon, and we've kept a watch behind us every day. Silk frowned. Go on, Geryon. I think he knew where we were going, Geryon blurted, struggling against a strange compulsion not to speak what his mind saw clearly now.
And what else do you think?
Wolf asked. Somebody told him. Somebody who knew we were coming here. Mingan knew, Silk said. But Mingan's a merchant, and he wouldn't talk about his dealings to somebody like Brill. But Asherak the Murgo was in Mingan's counting room when Mingan hired us. The compulsion was so strong now that Geryon's tongue felt stiff. Silk shrugged. Why should it concern him? Asherak didn't know who we were. But what if he did? Geryon struggled. What if he isn't just an ordinary Murgo, but one of those others? Like the one who was with those ones who passed us a couple of days after we left Darain. A Grolem? Silk said, and his eyes widened. Yes. I suppose that if Asherak's a Grolem, he'd have known who we are and what we're doing. And what if the Grolem who passed us that day was Asherak? Geryon fought to say it. What if he wasn't really looking for us, but just coming south to find Brill and send him here to wait for us? Silk looked very hard at Geryon. Very good, he said softly. Very, very good. He glanced at Aunt Pole. My compliments, Mistress Pole. You have raised a rare boy here.
What did this Asherak look like?
Wolf asked quickly. Murgo, Silk shrugged. He said he was from Rakoska. I took him to be an ordinary spy on some business that did not concern us. My mind seems to have gone to sleep.
It happens when one deals with Grolems,
Wolf told him. Someone's watching us, Dernick said quietly, from that window up there. Geryon looked up quickly and saw a dark shape at a second-story window, outlined by a dim light. The shape was hauntingly familiar. Mr. Wolf did not look up, but his face turned blank as if he were looking inward, or his mind were searching for something. Then he drew himself up and looked at the figure in the window, his eyes blazing.
A Grolem,
he said shortly. A dead one, perhaps, Silk said. He reached inside his tunic and drew out a long, needle-pointed dirk. He took 2 quick steps away from the house where the Grolem stood watching, spun, and threw the dirk with a smooth, overhand cast. The dirk crashed through the window. There was a muffled shout, and the light went out. Gurion felt a strange pang in his left arm. "Marked him," Silk said with a grin.
"Good throw,"
Beric said admiringly. "One has picked up certain skills," Silk said modestly. "If it was Asherak, I owed him that for deceiving me in Mingan's counting room."
"At least it will give him something to think about," Wolf said. "There's no point in trying to creep through town now. They know we're here. Let's mount then and ride."
He climbed onto his horse and led the way down the street at a quick walk. The compulsion was gone now, and Gurion wanted to tell them about Asherak, but there was no chance for that as they rode. Once they reached the outskirts of the city, they nudged their horses into a fast canter. The snow was falling more seriously now, and the hoof-churned ground in the vast cattle pens was already faintly dusted with white. "It's going to be a cold night," Silk shouted as they rode.
"We could always go back to Muros," Beric suggested. "Another scuffle or 2 might warm your blood."
Silk laughed and put his heels to his horse again. The encampment of the Algars was 3 leagues to the east of Muros. It was a large area surrounded by a stout palisade of poles set in the ground. The snow by now was falling thickly enough to make the camp look hazy and indistinct. The gate, flanked by hissing torches, was guarded by 2 fierce-looking warriors in leather leggings, snow-dusted jerkins of the same material, and pot-shaped steel helmets. The points of their lances glittered in the torchlight.
"Halt!"
one of the warriors commanded, leveling his lance at Mr. Wolf.
"What business have you here this time of night?" "I have urgent need of speaking with your herdmaster," Wolf replied politely. "May I step down?" The 2 guards spoke together briefly. "You may come down,"
one of them said.
"Your companions, however, must withdraw somewhat, but not beyond the light."
"Algars," Silk muttered under his breath. "Always suspicious." Mr. Wolf climbed down from the horse, and, throwing back his hood, approached the 2 guards through the snow. Then a strange thing happened. The elder of the 2 guards stared at Mr. Wolf, taking in his silver hair and beard. His eyes suddenly opened very wide. He quickly muttered something to his companion, and the 2 men bowed deeply to Wolf.
"There isn't time for that," Wolf said with annoyance. "Convey me to your herdmaster."
"At once, Ancient One," the elder guard said quickly, and hurried to the open gate. "What was that about?" Gurion whispered to Aunt Paul. "Algars are superstitious," she said shortly. "Don't ask so many questions." They waited with snow settling down upon them and melting on their horses. After about a half-hour, the gate opened again, and 24 mounted Algars, fierce in their riveted, studded leather vests and steel helmets, herded 6 saddled horses out into the snow. Behind them, Mr. Wolf walked, accompanied by a tall man with his head shaved, except for a flowing scalp lock. "You have honored our camp by your visit, Ancient One, and I wish you all speed on your journey."
"I have little fear of being delayed with Algar horses under us," Wolf replied.
"My riders will accompany you along a route they know, which will put you on the far side of Muros within a few hours," the tall man said. "They will then linger for a time, to be certain that you are not followed."
"I cannot express my gratitude, noble herdmaster," Wolf said, bowing.
"It is I who am grateful for the opportunity to be of service," the herdmaster said, also bowing. The change to their new horses took only a minute. With half of their contingent of Algars leading, and the other half bringing up the rear, they turned and rode back toward the west through the dark, snowy night. Chapter 10. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the darkness became paler as the softly falling snow made indistinct even the arrival of morning. Their seemingly inexhaustible horses pounded on through the growing light, the sound of their hooves muffled by the snow now lying fetlock deep on the broad surface of the great north road. Garin glanced back once and saw the jumbled tracks of their passage stretching behind them, and already at the hazy gray limit of his vision beginning to fill with concealing snow. When it was fully light, Mr. Wolf reined in his steaming horse and proceeded at a walk for a time. "How far have we come?" he asked Silk. The weasel-faced man who had been shaking the snow out of the folds of his cloak looked around, trying to pick out a landmark in the misty veil of dropping flakes. 10 leagues, he said finally. "Perhaps a bit more."
"This is a miserable way to travel,"
Beric rumbled, wincing slightly as he shifted his bulk in the saddle. "Think of how your horse must feel," Silk grinned at him. "How far is it to Kamar?" Aunt Paul asked. 40 leagues from Euros, Silk told her. "We'll need shelter then. We can't gallop 40 leagues without rest, no matter who is behind us."
"I don't think we need to worry about pursuit just now," Wolf said. "I think we can count on the Algars to detain Brill and his hirelings, or even Asherak, if they try to follow us."
"At least there is something Algars are good for, then," Silk said dryly.
"If I remember right, there should be an Imperial hostel, about 5 leagues farther to the west. We ought to reach it by noon."
"Will we be allowed to stay there?" Dernick asked doubtfully.
"I've never heard that Tolnetrans are noted for their hospitality."
"Tolnetrans sell anything for a price," Silk said. "The hostel would be a good place to stop. Even if Brill or Asherak evade the Algars and follow us there, the Legionnaires won't permit any foolishness within their walls." "Why should there be Tolnedran soldiers in Sindaria?" Garion asked, feeling a brief surge of patriotic resentment at the thought. "Wherever the great roads are, you will find the legions," Silk said. "Tolnedrans are even better at writing treaties than they are at giving short weight to their customers."
Mr. Wolf chuckled. "You're inconsistent, Silk. You don't object to their highways, but you dislike their legions. You can't have the one without the other."
"Oh, I've never pretended to be consistent," the sharp-nosed man said airily. "If we want to reach the questionable comfort of the Imperial hostel by noon, hadn't we better move along? I would not want to deny His Imperial Majesty the opportunity to pick my pocket."
"All right, let's ride," said Wolf,
and he put his heels to the flanks of the Algar horse, which had already begun to prance impatiently under him. The hostel, when they reached it in the full light of snowy noon, proved to be a series of stout buildings surrounded by an even stouter wall. The legionnaires who manned it were not the sort of men as the Tolnedran merchants Gerion had seen before. Unlike the oily men of commerce, these were hard-faced professional fighting men in burnished breastplates and plumed helmets. They carried themselves proudly, even arrogantly, each bearing the knowledge that the might of all Tunedra was behind him. The food in the dining hall was plain and wholesome, but dreadfully expensive. The tiny sleeping cubicles were scrupulously clean, with hard, narrow beds and thick woolen blankets, and were also expensive. The stables were neat, and they, too, reached deeply into Mr. Wolf's purse. Gerion wondered at the thought of how much their lodging was costing, but Wolf paid for it all with seeming indifference, as if his purse were bottomless.
"We'll rest here until tomorrow,"
the white-bearded old man announced when they had finished eating.
"Maybe it will snow itself out by morning. I am not happy with all this plunging blindly through a snowstorm. Too many things can hide in our path in such weather."
Gerion, who by now was numb with exhaustion, heard the words gratefully as he half drowsed at the table. The others sat talking quietly. but he was too tired to listen to what they were saying. "Garion," Aunt Paul said finally, "why don't you go to bed?"
"I'm all right, Aunt Paul,"
he said, rousing himself quickly, mortified once more at being treated like a child. "Now, Garion," she said in that infuriating tone he knew so well. It seemed that all his life she had been saying, "Now, Garion," to him, but he knew better than to argue. He stood up and was surprised to feel that his legs were trembling. Aunt Paul also rose and led him from the dining hall.
"I can find my way over myself,"
he objected. "Of course. Now, come along." After he had crawled into bed in his cubicle, she pulled his blankets up firmly around his neck. "Stay covered," she told him. "I don't want you taking cold." She laid her cool hand briefly on his forehead, as she had done when he was a small child.
"Aunt Paul?"
he asked drowsily. "Yes, Garion."
"Who were my parents? I mean, what were their names?"
She looked at him gravely.
"We can talk about that later." "I want to know," he said stubbornly.
"All right. Your father's name was Garan. Your mother's was Ildera." Garion thought about that.
"The names don't sound Sandarian."
"They're not."
"Well, why was that?"
"It is a very long story, and you are much too tired to hear it just now." On a sudden impulse he reached out and touched the white lock at her brow with the mark of the palm of his right hand. As had sometimes happened before, a window seemed to open in his mind at the tingling touch. But this time, that window opened on something much more serious. There was anger, and a single face, a face that was strangely like Mr. Wolfe's, but was not his face, and all the towering fury in the world was directed at that face. Aunt Paul moved her head away. "I have asked you not to do that, Garion," she said, her tone very matter-of-fact. "You are not ready for it yet."
"You're going to have to tell me what it is someday."
Perhaps, but not now. Close your eyes and go to sleep." And then, as if that command had somehow dissolved his will, he fell immediately into a deep, untroubled sleep. By the next morning, it had stopped snowing. The world outside the walls of the Imperial hostel was mantled in thick, unbroken white, and the air was filmy with a kind of damp haze that was almost, but not quite, fog. "Misty Cinderia," Silk said ironically at breakfast. "Sometimes I'm amazed that the entire kingdom doesn't rush shut." They traveled all that day at a mile-eating canter, and that night there was another Imperial hostel, almost identical to the one they had left that morning, so closely identical, in fact, that it almost seemed to Garion that they had ridden all day and merely arrived back where they had started. He commented on that to Silk as they were putting their horses in the stable. "Tonedrons are nothing, if not predictable," Silk said. "All their hostels are exactly the same. You can find these same buildings in Dresnia, Algeria, Arindia, and any place else their great roads go. It's their one weakness, this lack of imagination."
"Well, don't they get tired of doing the same thing over and over again?"
"It makes them feel uncomfortable, I guess," Silk laughed. "Come, let's go see about supper." It snowed again the following day, but by noon Garion caught a scent other than that faintly dusty odor snow always seemed to have. Even as he had done when they had approached Darin, he began to smell the sea, and he knew their journey was almost at an end. Kama'ar, the largest city in Cinderia, and the major seaport of the north, was a sprawling place which had existed at the mouth of the greater Kama'ar River since antiquity. It was the natural western terminus of the Great North Road, which stretched to Bakhtor and Dresnia, and the equally natural northern end of the Great West Road, which reached down across Arindia into Tolnedra, and the imperial capital at Tolhunath. With some accuracy, it could be said that all roads ended at Kamar. Late on a chill, snowy afternoon, they rode down a gradual hill toward the city. Some distance from the gate, Aunt Paul stopped her horse. "Since we are no longer posing as vagabonds, I see no further need for selecting the most disreputable inns, do you?"
"I had not really thought about it," Mr. Wolf said.
"Well, I have. I've had more than enough of wayside hostels and seedy village inns. I need a bath, a clean bed, and some decent food. If you don't mind, I will choose our lodging this time."
"Of course, Paul," the wolf said mildly. "Whatever you say."
"Very well, then," she said, and rode on toward the city gate with the rest of them trailing behind her.
"What's your business in Kamar?"
one of the fur-mantled guards at the broad gate asked her rather rudely. Aunt Paul threw back her hood and fixed the man with a steely gaze. "I am the Duchess of Erat," she announced in ringing tones. "These are my retainers, and my business in Kamar is my own affair." The guard blinked, then bowed respectfully.
"Forgive me, Your Grace. I didn't intend to give offense."
"Indeed," Aunt Paul said, her tone still cold and her gaze still dangerous.
"I didn't recognize Your Grace," the poor man floundered, squirming under that imperious stare. "May I offer you any assistance?"
"I hardly think so," Aunt Paul said, looking him up and down. "Which is the finest inn in Kamar?"
"That would be the Lion, my lady."
"And?" she said impatiently.
"And what, my lady?"
the man said, confused by her question. "Where is it? Don't stand there gaping like a dolt. Speak up."
"It lies beyond the customs houses," the guard replied, flushing at her words. "Follow this street till you reach Customs Square. Anyone there can direct you to the Lion."
Aunt Paul pulled her hood back up. "Give this fellow something," she said over her shoulder, and rode on into the city without a backward glance.
"My thanks,"
the guard said, as Wolf leaned down to hand him a small coin.
"I must admit that I haven't heard of the Duchess of Herat before."
"You are indeed a fortunate man," the wolf said.
"Oh, she's a great beauty," the man said admiringly.
"Mm-hmm. And has a temper to match," Wolf told him.
"Yes, I noticed that."
"We noticed you noticing," Silk told him slyly. They nudged their horses and caught up with Aunt Paul. "The Duchess of Herat?" Silk asked mildly. "That fellow's manner irritated me," Aunt Paul said loftily, "and I am tired of putting on a poor face in front of strangers." At Customs Square, Silk accosted a busy-looking merchant trudging across the snow-covered paving. "You, fellow," he said in the most insulting way possible, pulling his horse directly in front of the startled merchant. "My mistress, the Duchess of Herat, requires directions to an inn called the Lion. Be so good as to provide them." The merchant blinked, his face flushing at the rat-faced man's tone.
"Up that street,"
he said softly, pointing.
"Some goodly way. It will be on the left. There's a sign of a lion at the front."
Silk sniffed ungraciously, tossed a few coins into the snow at the man's feet, and whirled his horse in a grand manner. The merchant, Geryon noted, looked outraged, but he did grope in the snow for the coins Silk had thrown.
"I doubt that any of these people will quickly forget our passage," Wolf said sourly, when they were some way up the street.
"Oh, they'll remember the passing of an arrogant noblewoman. It's a good disguise, as good as any we've tried." When they arrived at the inn, Aunt Paul commanded not just the usual sleeping chambers, but an entire apartment. "My chamberlain will pay you," she said to the innkeeper, indicating Mr. Wolfe. "Our baggage horses are some days behind with the rest of my servants, so I'll require the services of a dressmaker and a maid. See to it." And she turned and swept imperially up the long staircase that led to her apartment, following the servant who scurried ahead to show her the way. "The Duchess has a commanding presence, doesn't she?" the innkeeper ventured as Wolfe began counting out the coins.
"She has indeed. I have discovered the wisdom of not countering her wishes."
"I'll be guided by you, then," the innkeeper assured him. "My youngest daughter is a serviceable girl. I'll dispatch her to serve as her Grace's maid."
"Oh, many thanks, friend," said Silk. "Our lady becomes most irritable when those things she desires are delayed, and we are the ones who suffer most from her displeasure." They trooped up the stairs to the apartments Aunt Paul had taken and stepped into the main sitting room, a splendid chamber far richer than any Geryon had seen before. The walls were covered by tapestries with intricate pictures woven into the fabric. A wealth of candles, real wax instead of smoky tallow, gleamed in sconces on the walls and in a massive candelabra on the polished table. A good warm fire danced merrily on the hearth, and a large carpet of curious design lay on the floor. Aunt Paul was standing before the fire, warming her hands. "Is this not better than some shabby wharfside inn, reeking of fish and unwashed sailors?"
"If the Duchess of Erat will forgive my saying so," the Wolf said somewhat tartly, "this is hardly the way to escape notice, and the cost of these lodgings would feed a legion for a week."
"Oh, don't grow parsimonious in your dotage, old Wolf," she replied. "No one takes a spoiled noblewoman seriously, and your wagons weren't able to keep that disgusting Brill from finding us. This guise is at least comfortable, and it permits us to move more rapidly."
Wolf grunted. "I only hope we won't regret all of this."
"Oh, stop grumbling, old man."
"Have it your way, Paul."
"Oh, I intend to."
"How are we to behave, Mistress Paul?" Dernick asked hesitantly. Her sudden regal manner had obviously confused him.
"I'm not familiar with the ways of the gentry."
"Oh, it's quite simple, Dernick," she said. She eyed him up and down, noticing his plain, dependable face and his solid competence. "How would you like to be chief groom to the Duchess of Erat and master of her stables?"
Dernick laughed uncomfortably. "Noble titles for work I've done all my life. I could manage the work easily enough, but the titles, they might grow a bit heavy."
"Oh, you'll do splendidly, friend Dernick," Silk assured him. "That honest face of yours makes people believe anything you choose to tell them. If I had a face like yours, I could steal half the world." He turned to Aunt Paul. "And what role am I to play, milady?" "You will be my reeve. The thievery usually associated with the position should suit you." Silk bowed ironically.
"And I?"
Barak said, grinning openly. "My man-at-arms. I doubt that any would believe you to be a dancing master. Just stand round looking dangerous." "What about me, Aunt Paul? What do I do?" "You can be my page." "What does a page do?" "You fetch things for me." "I've always done that." "Is that what it's called?" "Don't be impertinent. You also answer doors and announce visitors, and when I'm melancholy you may sing to me." "Sing? Me?" he said incredulously. It is customary." "You wouldn't make me do that, would you, Aunt Paul?" "Your Grace," she corrected. "Well, you won't be very gracious if you have to listen to me sing," he warned. "My voice isn't very good." "Oh, you'll do just fine, dear."
"And I've already been appointed your Grace's chamberlain," Wolf said.
"My chief steward, manager of my estates, and keeper of my purse."
"Somehow, I knew that would be part of it."
There was a timid rap at the door. "Oh, do see who that is, Geryon," Aunt Paul said. When he opened the door, Geryon found a young girl with light brown hair in a sober dress and starched apron and cap standing outside. She had very large brown eyes that looked at him apprehensively. "Yes?"
"I've been sent to wait upon the Duchess,"
she said in her low voice. "Your maid has arrived, Your Grace," Geryon announced. "Oh, splendid," Aunt Paul said. "Come in, child." The girl entered the room. "What a pretty thing you are."
"Thank you, my lady,"
the girl answered with a brief curtsy and rosy blush. "And what is your name?"
"I'm called Donia, my lady."
"Oh, a lovely name. Now, to important matters. Is there a bath on the premises?" It was still snowing the next morning. The roofs of nearby houses were piled high with white, and the narrow streets were deep with it.
"I think we're close to the end of our search,"
Mr. Wolfe said, as he stared intently out through the rippled glass of the window in the room with the tapestries. "It's unlikely that the one we're after would stay in Kamar for long."
Very unlikely.
"But once we've found his trail, we'll be able to move more rapidly.
Now let's get into the city and see if I'm right."
After Mr. Wolfe and Silk had left, Geryon sat for a while talking with Donia, who seemed to be about his own age. Although she was not quite as pretty as Zubret, Geryon found her soft voice and huge brown eyes extremely attractive. Things were going along well between them, until Aunt Paul's dressmaker arrived and Donia's presence was required in the chamber where the Duchess of Erat was being fitted for her new gowns. Since Dernick, obviously ill at ease in the luxurious surroundings of their chambers, had adjourned to the stables after breakfast, Geryon was left in the company of the giant Barak, who worked patiently with a small stone, polishing a nick out of the edge of his sword, a memento of the skirmish in Muros. Geryon had never been wholly comfortable with the huge red-bearded man. Barak spoke rarely, and there seemed to be a kind of hulking menace about him. So it was that Geryon spent the morning examining the tapestries on the walls of the sitting-room. The tapestries depicted knights in full armor and castles on hilltops, and strangely angular-looking maidens moping about in gardens.
"Arenders,"
Beric said, directly behind him. Geryon jumped. The huge man had moved up so quietly that Geryon had not heard him. "How can you tell?" Geryon asked politely.
"The Arons have a fondness for tapestry," Beric rumbled, "and the weaving of pictures. Occupies their women while the men are off denting each other's armor."
"Do they really wear all of that?" Geryon asked, pointing at a heavily armored knight pictured on the tapestry.
Oh, yes, that and more. Even their horses wear armor. It's a silly way to make a war."
Geryon scuffed his shoe on the carpet. "Is this Arendish too?" Beric shook his head.
"Malorian."
"How did it get here all the way from Meloria?" Geryon asked. "I've heard that Meloria is all the way on the other end of the world."
It's a goodly way off, but a merchant would go twice as far to make such a profit. Such goods as this commonly move along the north caravan route out of Garagnadrak to Bakhtor. Melorian carpets are prized by the wealthy. I don't much care for them myself, since I'm not fond of anything that has to do with the Angaraks."
"How many kinds of Angaraks are there?" "I know there are Murgos and Tolls, and I've heard stories about the Battle of Omimbre and all, but I don't know much about them, really."
"There are 5 tribes of them,"
Beric said, sitting back down and resuming his polishing.
"Murgos and Tolls, Nadraks and Malorians, and of course the Grolims. They live in the 4 kingdoms of the east: Maloria, Garagnadrak, Mishrak Aktul, and Chthalmurgos.
Where do the Grolums live?
They have no special place,
Beric replied grimly.
The Grolums are the priests of Bk1, and are everywhere in the lands of the Angaraks. They're the ones who perform the sacrifices to Torak. Grolum knives have spilled more Angarak blood than a dozen Vomembras.
Geryon shuddered. Why should Torak take such pleasure in the slaughter of his own people?
Who can say? He is a twisted and evil god. Some believe that he was made mad when he used the orb of Aldur to crack the world, and the orb repaid him by burning out his eyes and consuming his hand.
How could the world be cracked? I've never understood that part of the story.
The power of the orb of Aldur is such that it can accomplish anything. When Torak raised it, the earth was split apart by its power, and the seas came in to drown the land. The story is very old, but I think that it's probably true.
And where is the orb of Aldur now? Geryon asked suddenly. Beric looked at him, his eyes icy blue, and his face thoughtful. But he did not say anything. Do you know what I think? Geryon said on a sudden impulse. I think that it's the orb of Aldur that's been stolen. I think it's the orb that Mr. Wolf is trying to find.
And I think it would be better if you did not think so much about such things,
Beric warned. But I want to know, Geryon protested, his curiosity driving him even in the face of Beric's words, and the warning voice in his mind. Everyone treats me like an ignorant boy. All I do is tag along with no idea of what we're doing. Who is Mr. Wolf, anyway? Why did the Algars behave the way they did when they saw him? How can he follow something that he can't see? Please tell me, Beric.
Not me. Your Aunt Paul would pull out my beard whisker by whisker if I made that mistake.
You're not afraid of her, are you?
Any man with good sense is afraid of her,
Beric said, rising and sliding his sword into its sheath. Aunt Paul? Geryon asked incredulously.
Are you not afraid of her?
Beric asked pointedly. No, Geryon said, and then realized that was not precisely true. Well, not really afraid. It's more... He left it hanging, not knowing how to explain it.
Exactly. And I'm no more foolhardy than you, my boy. You are too full of questions. I'd be far wiser not to answer them. If you want to know about these things, you will have to ask your aunt.
But she won't tell me, Geryon said glumly. She won't tell me anything. She won't even tell me about my parents. Not really.
Beric frowned. That's strange.
I don't think they were Sendars. Their names weren't Sendarian, and Silk says that I'm not a Sendar. At least, I don't look like one.
Beric looked at him closely. No, he said finally. Now that you mention it, you don't. You look more like a raven than anything else. But not quite that either.
Is Aunt Paul a raven?
Beric's eyes narrowed slightly. I think we are getting to some more of those questions that I had better not answer.
I'm going to find out someday.
But not today. Come along. I need some exercise. Let's go out into the inn yard and I will teach you how to use a sword.
Me? Geryon said, all his curiosity suddenly melting away in the excitement of the thought.
"You are at an age where you should begin to learn," Beric said. "The occasion may someday arise when it'll be useful for you to know."
Late that afternoon, when Gerion's arm had begun to ache from the effort of swinging Beric's heavy sword, and the whole idea of learning the skills of a warrior had become a great deal less exciting, Mr. Wolf and Silk returned. Their clothes were wet from the snow through which they had trudged all day, but Wolf's eyes were bright, and his face had a curiously exultant expression as he led them all back up the stairs to the sitting-room.
"Ask your Aunt Paul to join us,"
he told Gerion, as he removed his sodden mantle and stepped to the fire to warm himself. Gerion sensed quickly that this was not the time for questions. He hurried to the polished door where Aunt Paul had been closeted with her dressmaker all day and rapped at the door.
"What is it?"
Her voice came from inside.
That is, your chamberlain has returned, milady?"
Gerion said, remembering at the last moment that she was not alone.
"He requests a word with you?" "Oh, very well," she said.
After a minute she came out, firmly closing the door behind her.
Gerion gasped.
The rich blue velvet gown she wore made her so magnificent that she quite took his breath away. He stared at her in helpless admiration.
"Where is he?" she asked. "Don't stand and gape, Gerion. It's not polite."
"You are beautiful, Aunt Paul."
"Yes, dear," she said, patting his cheek. "I know. Now where's the old wolf?"
"In the room with the tapestries," Gerion said, still unable to take his eyes from her.
"Come along, then,"
she said, and swept down the short hall to the sitting-room. They entered to find the others all standing by the fireplace.
"Well?"
she asked. Wolf looked up at her, his eyes still bright.
An excellent choice, Paul," he said admiringly. "Blue has always been your best color."
"Do you like it?"
she asked, holding out her arms and turning almost girlishly so that they all might see how fine she looked.
"I hope it pleases you, old man, because it is costing you a great deal of money."
Wolf laughed.
"I was almost certain that it would."
The effect of Aunt Paul's gown on Dernick was painfully obvious. The poor man's eyes literally bulged, and his face turned alternately very pale, then very red, then finally settled into an expression of such hopelessness that Gerion was touched to the quick by it. Silk and Beric in curious unison both bowed deeply and wordlessly to Aunt Paul, and her eyes sparkled at their silent tribute.
This ends Disc 5. Please change to Disc 6.